Paddy. It's no good. They know where we are.
The Benny Hill Show was a global sensation, reaching over 140 countries and making its star a household name. For decades, his slapstick comedy and risque sketches were celebrated. But what many people don't know is that behind the laughter, a cultural storm was brewing. It all came to a head with one specific scene, a sketch so controversial it couldn't be ignored. This wasn't just an off-color joke, it was the moment that brought a comedy empire crashing down, getting the show pulled from the airwaves for good. You're about to see what happens when comedy goes too far. The Southampton Spark. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, born in Southampton in the mid-1920s, was never destined for a quiet life. You see, while his father's world was one of sterile surgical tools and practicality, his grandfather's was the exact opposite. His granddad had been a circus clown, a man who lived and breathed performance. That legacy of laughter was a quiet hum in the background of Alfred's childhood, a promise of a world far more exciting than the one he knew. What many overlooked is that this contrast between the serious and the silly would become the very foundation of his entire career. Before he was Benny, he was just Alf, working a series of dead-end jobs. He was a milkman, a truck driver, a stock boy, and even a drummer. To put it mildly, his early resume wasn't exactly glamorous. But the thing nobody tells you is that these humble jobs were his training ground. He became a professional people watcher, studying the funny little habits, the awkward gestures, and the private moments people have when they think no one is looking. He was gathering material, absorbing the quirks of everyday life that he would later twist into comedy gold. One of his jobs was delivering goods to a Woolworth store where he was reportedly let go for his antics, a clear sign of the performer itching to break free. Then came the Second World War, a global tragedy that unexpectedly set him on his path. As a mechanic and later a searchlight operator in the British Army, he learned discipline, but his true calling came when he was transferred to the entertainment division. On makeshift stages, in front of soldiers exhausted by the horrors of war, he discovered the sheer power of making someone laugh. It wasn't just a distraction, it was a lifeline. He learned that a perfectly timed gag could be as vital as a warm meal. This experience solidified his mission. Comedy wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. After the war, he dove headfirst into the world of showbiz, drawing inspiration from the British music hall comics he admired. But his biggest hero was an American, radio host Jack Benny. Alf was so captivated by Jack's masterful timing and wit that he adopted his first name, becoming Benny Hill. He broke into radio in 1947, but it was a stepping stone. His comedy was profoundly visual. It needed to be seen. The most shocking fact is, for a man who would become famous for his expressive face, he started in a medium with no visuals at all. By 1950, he found his true home on television, a new frontier perfect for his brand of physical, in-your-face humor. The stage was finally set for the creation of a global phenomenon. But the journey from a local boy to a comedy king was far from over. When Britain ruled the airwaves. When The Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC on January 15, 1955, television had never seen anything quite like it. In an era of polite, wordy comedies, Benny Hill crashed the party with loud, chaotic visual gags. He took the old-school charm of British music hall and injected it with the high-octane energy of modern television. Every episode was a whirlwind of short sketches, song parodies, and slapstick that relied on silly faces and pratfalls, not clever punchlines. People were crazy about it. It was comedy that you didn't need to think about. You just had to watch. But the show's golden era truly began when it moved to Thames Television in 1969. This move gave Hill more creative control and, crucially, a bigger budget. He started producing hour-long specials instead of weekly episodes, allowing him to create more elaborate and ambitious sketches. And you can see this everywhere in the show's later years. The production value soared. This format was a smash hit. By the 1970s, The Benny Hill Show wasn't just a British favorite, it was an international juggernaut syndicated in a staggering 140 countries. The most shocking fact is that his humor, which often contained no dialogue at all, was universally understood. A man getting chased by a mob of angry ladies is funny in any language. The show's success was built on a cast of unforgettable characters. There was Fred Scuttle, the bumbling fool with his signature salute and nonsensical chatter. And then there was the little bald man, Jackie Wright, who became Hill's favorite comedic punching bag. Hill would repeatedly slap him on the head, and Jackie's deadpan reaction only made it funnier. These recurring figures felt like a bizarre extended family, and audiences tuned in every week to see what kind of trouble they'd get into. Of course, no episode was complete without the iconic closing chase scene. Set to the frantic saxophone-fueled tune Yakety Sax, the entire cast would run in circles in fast motion. Nurses, policemen, old grannies, and a gaggle of scantily clad women would pursue Benny through parks and city streets. This segment became so legendary that Yakety Sax is now universally known as the Benny Hill theme, a cultural shorthand for any moment of pure, unadulterated absurdity. In the 1980s, he added Hill's Angels, a troupe of dancers whose routines brought a new level of glitz to the show, but also a new level of scrutiny. But not all things are what they seem, and this new addition would eventually be used as evidence against him. At its peak in 1971, the show drew an incredible 21 million viewers in the UK alone. That's more than a third of the entire population at the time. Hill was on top of the world, a comedy king with a global empire. But a change was coming. The point of no return. By the late 1980s, the Benny Hill Show was an institution, but cracks were beginning to show in its foundation. For years, critics had whispered that the show's humor was dated. They argued that its endless parade of suggestively dressed women running from a leering man was, to put it mildly, out of touch. Fans dismissed this as killjoy criticism, insisting it was all just harmless fun. For a long time, the laughter of millions drowned out the complaints. Then came the one sketch that could not be dismissed. The one scene that became a lightning rod for every criticism ever leveled against the show. The setup was classic Benny Hill, a parody of a beauty pageant. Hill, playing a smarmy host, introduced a lineup of contestants. The women, dressed in revealing outfits, were presented not as people, but as props for a series of visual gags. This was familiar territory for the show, a formula that had worked for decades. The thing nobody tells you is that it wasn't the setup that caused the firestorm, it was the punchline. In the sketch, one of the contestants is a little person, and Hill's character pats her on the head in a patronizing way, a moment so cringe-inducing it felt less like comedy and more like schoolyard bullying. For many viewers, this was the moment the mask slipped. The cheeky, harmless fun suddenly looked mean-spirited and cheap. It wasn't just a bad joke, it was a joke that seemed to punch down, to mock someone for their physical appearance in a way that felt cruel. What many overlooked at the time was the shifting cultural landscape. Society was changing, and a new generation of viewers was far more sensitive to issues of representation and respect. The beauty pageant sketch landed like a lead balloon in this new environment. The backlash was swift and brutal. Newspapers, which had once celebrated Hill, now ran columns questioning if his brand of humor had a place on television anymore. Feminist groups, who had long criticized the show's one-dimensional portrayal of women, now had a perfect, undeniable example of its tastelessness. This wasn't just about a risque chase scene, it was about a fundamental lack of respect. The sketch became Exhibit A in the case against Benny Hill. You see, it crystallized every negative stereotype about the show. It was old-fashioned, it was demeaning, and worst of all, it just wasn't funny anymore. This one moment provided all the ammunition his detractors needed to launch their final assault. The world was changing, and Benny Hill was about to be left behind. When satire took over. While Benny Hill was playing out his pageant parody, a revolution was taking place in British comedy. A new generation of performers, dubbed alternative comedians, was storming the stage. They were sharp, political, and angry. Their humor wasn't about silly walks or chase scenes. It was about tearing down the establishment, challenging social norms, and providing biting satire. At the forefront of this movement was a young comedian named Ben Elton, a co-writer of the anarchic sitcom The Young Ones. Elton wasn't just telling jokes, he was on a mission to change comedy itself. And for Elton and his peers, Benny Hill was public enemy number one. He represented everything they despised about the old guard, the lazy stereotypes, the predictable formulas, and what they saw as a deeply ingrained, disrespectful attitude. Elton famously went on the offensive, publicly accusing the Benny Hill Show of being harmful. He argued that the show's relentless objectification of women wasn't just a bit of fun but contributed to a toxic culture. It was an explosive accusation that drew a line in the sand. You were either with Benny, the master of harmless slapstick, or you were with the new wave, who saw him as a relic promoting dangerous ideas. The media frenzy was immediate. Many critics and younger audiences rallied behind Elton, seeing him as a truth-teller who was finally calling out the problematic nature of Hill's work. But not everyone agreed. Many people, including fellow comedians and journalists, rushed to Hill's defense. They argued that it was absurd to blame a lighthearted comedy show for society's problems. They painted Elton as an overly sensitive upstart trying to make a name for himself by tearing down a legend. The debate raged in newspapers and on talk shows. Was Benny Hill a harmless entertainer or a menace to society? But not all things are what they seem, and the narrative surrounding the decline of Benny Hill is far more complex than a simple case of a comedian falling out of fashion. This wasn't just about two comedians or even about one man's career. It was a full-blown culture war, and Benny Hill, the beloved court jester of post-war Britain, found himself unwittingly cast as the lead villain on the wrong side of history. The most shocking fact, a paradox that is often overlooked, is that while Hill was still a massive, bankable star internationally, his silent slapstick sketches syndicated and adored in over 100 countries, he was rapidly becoming a pariah in his own country. What was considered wholesome, family-friendly fun just a decade earlier was now being refracted through a new, more critical lens. The Britain of the 1980s was a fractured and contentious place, a battleground of ideologies under Thatcherism, and entertainment was not exempt from the conflict. The world had moved on, and a new generation of viewers and critics expected more from their entertainment. The rise of alternative comedy brought with it a wave of political satire and socially conscious humor that was loud, aggressive, and fiercely intelligent. Comedians like Rick Mayall, Ben Elton, and the cast of Spitting Image were using comedy as a weapon to dissect the establishment, challenge social norms, and rail against inequality. Against this backdrop of biting anti-establishment wit, Hill's work seemed embarrassingly primitive by comparison. His gentle, music hall-inspired sketches, rooted in seaside postcard humor and vaudevillian tradition, suddenly appeared tone-deaf and anachronistic. He was an artist from a different era, a time of consensus and deference that no longer existed. The tide had turned with breathtaking speed, and the very things that had made Benny Hill a global superstar, his trademark cheeky humor, the bawdy double entendres, and his iconic cast of scantily clad Hill's Angels, were now the primary reasons he was being condemned. What was once a playful wink was now interpreted as a lecherous leer. The famous fast-motion chase scenes with Hill gleefully pursuing a bevy of beautiful women were no longer seen as harmless romps, but as troubling representations of female objectification. The Hill's Angels, once a glamorous and celebrated part of the show's appeal, became a symbol of its inherent gender bias. Critics, particularly from emerging feminist perspectives and left-leaning publications, painted him as a dinosaur, a purveyor of cheap, gender-biased smut that had no place on modern television. He wasn't just a comedian who told dated jokes, he was a cultural artifact, a symbol of an older, simpler, and, in the eyes of his detractors, more ignorant Britain that needed to be swept away. He had become a casualty of the very culture he had once so perfectly entertained. So, was Benny Hill a victim of changing times, or was his comedy genuinely harmful? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about the moments that changed television forever.